You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 304 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show is Will Porter. He's a journalist, writes on U.S. foreign policy and, the Middle East and all the things going on in the world. Great analyst, does a lot of stuff on Russiagate too. So Will, I got you back on the show today to finish our 2018 review series here in late January. So a little bit late on it, but this is the worst of Donald Trump. And so certainly the heavier part of our, best and worst of Trump series here. I guess, to not take too much time here at the start and just get into it. If you want to find mine and Will's work, one of the best places to do that is libertarianinstitute.org. Will's work can also be found at antiwar.com and consortiumnews.com. Will, I guess welcome to the show, and then I'm going to ask you questions about Yemen.
All right, cool, man. I'm glad to be back. Thanks for having me.
All right, so Yemen stuff in 2018, I can't see anywhere that this really got any better. There were some maybe glimmers of hope through the year. War Powers Act resolution more moving forward. You had a brief period of time after the Khashoggi murder where it looked like the U.S. may be taking some action in Yemen or some of our European allies. But conditions never improved and pretty bleak the whole way through. So I guess let's start here in the U.S. with our Congress and talk a little bit about some of the congressional initiatives in 2018.
Yeah, sure. So there's actually been two major initiatives in both houses, in the Congress and the Senate in the U.S. And one was H-Con Res 138, and then the Senate had its companion bill called Joint Resolution 54. And basically both bills would, if totally passed, they would force the president to remove armed forces from the conflict in Yemen within 30 days, short of a declaration of war. And this would be with the exception of the troops that are stationed in Yemen to fight Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula, or AQAP, who are apparently justified being there under the ridiculously broad 2001 AUMF, or the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. However, that would still be a good start. Now, the Senate resolution was adopted, but still has yet to be approved by Congress, I think, and make it past the president. While I believe the House's companion bill has been shelved by the insertion of some rule into the agriculture bill, or the farm bill. And I'm not totally sure about what the status is of the House bill, and whether it's done for good, whether it's set aside temporarily or what. Maybe you understand this better, Kyle.
Yeah, I think what the there was an amendment to the farm bill that basically, I think, stripped the privileged status from that Yemen War Powers Act 132, claiming that it didn't, I guess, rise to the war powers level. The U.S. intervention in Yemen didn't rise to the war powers level. So I guess this is a good time, Will, to talk not only about the lies in the congressional testimony from the Pentagon, saying that the U.S. really wasn't involved militarily in Yemen, and then, since information coming out that we have, I believe, Green Berets in southern Saudi Arabia that have helped the Saudis try to track down some of the Yemeni ballistic missiles, but also Nick Turse and Yahoo News revealing that the United States helped train the UAE in their ability to, I guess, provide mid-air refueling, it seems like.
Yeah, so clearly in those examples, the idea that this conflict doesn't rise up to the level that the War Power Resolution could apply to it, that seems outrageous. That seems like that can't be right. Now, with the House version of this bill, the War Powers Resolution, this was sponsored by Ro Khanna of California and a Kentucky Republican, Thomas Massie, and then the Senate version was sponsored by Bernie Sanders. And I forget if anybody on the Republican side co-sponsored that with him.
I think Mike Lee and Chris Murphy were the other two initial co-sponsors. I know later on that many other senators co-sponsored, including even Elizabeth Warren. So it got pretty mainstream Democratic support and co-sponsorship and everything by that.
Yeah, I think eventually all the Democratic senators actually did vote for it, and then 7 Republicans, including Rand Paul, did too. But right around the time the Senate was doing this, they also adopted another joint resolution, number 69, which is a proposal that criticized Saudi Arabia's human rights record, blamed the Khashoggi killing and the Crown Prince, and called for a diplomatic solution for the conflict in Yemen. And so that stuff I think that was also adopted. So that's sort of another promising movement. Not much has really happened with this. As we said, the House version has sort of been set aside or shelved. But as I said, this stuff is kind of a good start.
Right. And maybe we should take another tangent really quick and probably one, a significant story from 2018 that we'll talk about years to come was the Khashoggi murder. So early October, Jamal Khashoggi visits the Saudi consulate in Turkey, enters, never leaves. It's still not, I think, officially known, but believed that he was murdered somehow there, injected with the drug, and then his body was cut into pieces and removed and is now where nobody knows. So, that's the alleged story. Still don't have a body, so I guess there's still some question marks. But it's pretty clear that, the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, his younger brother Khalid bin Salman, and then several other high-ranking Saudis were involved in this murder. However, the Trump administration has really allowed the Saudi state to get away with placing the blame on an advisor to Mohammed bin Salman and then 14 other kind of high-ranking Saudi officials. I think some probably more bodyguard status than an actual advisor to the king or held a ministry position in the Saudi government. But 5 of those men are facing execution now. And I guess, kind of just to wrap up real quick with the whole thing, it looks like Mohammed bin Salman will retain power anyways. But this had a pretty big impact, I think. Germany, I believe, cut their weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. They actually saw their weapon sales go down 23% in 2018, in part because they didn't sell weapons to Saudi Arabia in the fourth quarter of that year. So there are some lasting impacts to the Saudis, but I don't know where else you want to jump off on the Khashoggi thing.
Well, yeah, I would just add that the Khashoggi killing definitely provided a lot of the impetus for these congressional efforts against the war in Yemen. A lot of people cited these things, cited the Khashoggi killing as why we can't tolerate this any longer. And then you also just have things going on in Yemen that are almost impossible to deny. The horror of them. Earlier in 2018, the Saudis bombed a school bus full of kids and that killed 50 people. And so things like that are kind of, that and the Khashoggi killing are definitely driving some of the opposition to the war in Yemen right now.
Yeah, well, I mean, and just to highlight that story, as I think probably one of the worst single atrocities in Yemen in 2018, a school bus in a marketplace was bombed by Saudi Arabia, killing almost every child aboard that school bus. And then they claimed it was a legitimate target, was I would say probably the most baffling thing. The initial thing was, yeah, it was a fair target, claiming I think the bus was transporting weapons or something like that. Eventually that does get walked back by the Saudi government, but nobody's ever held accountable. And there's 44 dead Yemeni children, little kids that are quite literally blown to bits. And, the poor souls that have to go through and pick up, the various body parts that were left behind by that attack is absolutely horrific. And it's just an interesting contrast that you have some older, middle-aged, Washington Post journalist who isn't by any means the greatest humanitarian activist in the world, but because he works for the Washington Post, he dies, and it's a huge story. And then you have 44 Yemeni children that are killed in this single bombing, and that doesn't elicit any reaction. I do want to just take back and point out that for the most part, I think in 2018, the very strict Saudi inspection regime of all aid, food, fuel, any kind of goods entering Yemen continued. And this basically is a de facto blockade of the country. It could take weeks to get through the Saudi inspection regime. Things go bad in that time. And it really, the humanitarian situation there has just continued to deteriorate through 2018. I don't know, Will, if you see any major events in 2018 related to the humanitarian situation there, other than it just seems to be continuing to getting worse. And now we have tens of thousands of Yemeni people who are actually in famine conditions.
Yeah, definitely. There are a few illustrative cases or just like emblematic cases in 2018, or stories, I should say. So at the beginning of this year, you had the World Health Organization or Doctors Without Borders. Their number was they had 1 million suspected cases of cholera. Because in Yemen, because of the destruction of hospitals and roads and infrastructure, around the rainy seasons, diseases like cholera and diphtheria are starting to take a really big toll on people. They can't really deal with these things with their medical infrastructure. And so, yeah, at the beginning of this year, at the end of 2017, you had a figure that said 1 million suspected cases of cholera, which we should emphasize doesn't mean there definitely were 1 million cases, but it means they were suspected. 1 million people showed up to health facilities with diarrhea, which is a major symptom of cholera. And so, that I think is pretty emblematic of the how bad the humanitarian situation is. The epidemic of cholera in Yemen might be the biggest in human history. So Yemen might have made the books in one of the worst ways possible here. And it's, thanks in part to Uncle Sam and the assistance we give to the Saudi coalition. Yet another...
And keeping out of, critical aid like chlorine tablets, which is really all you need, I think, to combat a cholera outbreak.
Yeah, exactly. You really just need, you need to keep people hydrated and stuff. That's really, one of the major ways to combat this illness. And indeed, it has been eradicated in most developed countries, but Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the region. And, even prior to that, they could deal with it. But now, because of the destruction of the infrastructure and over 60% of Yemen's hospitals and health facilities, they can't really deal with it. But the other sort of emblematic story that I would bring up here, or another one, is finally we have a more accurate casualty figure. And so I think it was March of last year that I came on your show to talk about my reporting on the UN's casualty figure and just how poor it was and how inadequate it was. I think August of 2018, this is a little bit after this is after I did my prior report on the figure. But the last time the UN revised their casualty figure, they had 6,500 dead and 10,000 wounded. And I think at this point they've pretty much stopped counting altogether. But that figure is almost preposterously low, given the intensity of the conflict, and given that their previous estimates had been right around that level for months and maybe even years. Which is really unfortunate because the Western press will only use this official UN figure, and they won't try to report into it independently. They just kind of blindly rely on this tally, and they never write in caveats into their coverage, or they never mention the limitations of the figure they're citing. So the public is kind of kept in the dark about, the impact of the war. And I was actually working on another piece, trying to get into this casualty figure. I had found a Yemeni NGO source who was going to be able to vouch for 15,000 civilian deaths and 50,000 injuries, or 50,000 people injured, which would have revised the UN civilian death toll by threefold and their wounded figure by a multiple of 5. But right around when I was working on this story, a group called ACLED, or the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, they dropped their own data, and I kind of got scooped by the mainstream press on this. And I think Patrick Coburn, actually, a great reporter at The Independent, was a bit earlier than a lot of the other mainstream outlets. But finally, a more accurate figure made the rounds in the mainstream press. And ACLED found that at least 50,000 people had been killed in Yemen in this initial report, and this is since the beginning of the war in March of 2015. However, an analyst from the ACLED organization has since said that the casualty toll might be as high as 80,000. So we're now approaching 100,000 casualties in Yemen, perhaps. And there's a Yemeni journalist that we follow named Nasser Arabi who had basically been giving these similar estimates for a while, that, he seemed to maybe be onto this well before the UN was. And so overall, this is mostly just bad news, these two emblematic cases of the huge cholera figure. And the ACLED data is sort of like a mixed thing. It's good we have more accurate data now, but it's a terrible, the toll is so high. It's really bad news.
Right, and I believe the ACLED number is like a body count number. These are people that they could confirm have been killed, not necessarily all the people who have died out in places where the numbers don't get counted, as well as people who have died, in the humanitarian crisis. I guess, to kind of summarize the battlefield in Yemen in 2018, it really didn't change. The territory held by the Houthis was held by the Houthis. I guess it's worth noting that going into 2018, there was some question on what ability the Houthis would have to retain power after the death of their longtime foe and then short-time ally, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the longtime leader of Yemen. He, turned on the Houthis late 2017 and was killed. And then the Houthis seem to be able to mostly consolidate power. Saudi Arabia did make some progress up the coastline of the Red Sea in western Yemen, and their Yemeni armed forces now hold territory just to the south of the city of Hadada. I guess I just kind of want to wrap up the Yemen section here by talking about the peace talks that happened late in 2018. The fact that the battle for that city, there's currently a very weak ceasefire in place. The other terms of the Stockholm deal, which is where the peace talks occurred, have not been implemented, and it doesn't seem like people are super optimistic about the peace talks and the peace process and the Hadada ceasefire going in to 2019 here, Will. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that. Like I said, the battlefield's pretty much unchanged. The media lines are pretty much unchanged. It's all Iran's fault. The Houthis need to stop launching missiles at Saudi Arabia. But the bombs continue to rain down on the people of Yemen.
Yeah, I guess one thing I could say here is just to emphasize the importance of the Hodeidah port. Like 70 or 80% of Yemen's food and aid imports and half of its fuel imports are met by just this single port. And so sort of like getting this ceasefire to stick is pretty important for the humanitarian situation in Yemen. There's something called the Red Sea Trade Corridor, which is basically like a highway that leads out from Hodeidah to the rest of the interior of Yemen, including the capital city of Sana'a a little further north. And part of the Stockholm deal was to set up some kind of demilitarized zones that would allow freight and stuff to pass through there, allow shipments of aid to pass through there. And because, there have been issues with fighting, that corridor has had to shut down before. And so this is like, the port of Hodeidah is extremely important to the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, and it is important that this gets resolved.
So in the show notes page here, I'm going to link to at least the two most recent episodes that me and Will have discussed Yemen on, because we could really talk about this for hours. It's a war that we've both followed very closely in the past 4 years, and there's a lot we have to say about, but we can't do it all on this show. I want to move on to Iran and the nuclear deal. Trump threatened to, withdraw from this thing throughout his presidency. I don't know what else the Iranians could have done to keep the U.S. in the deal. The conditions laid out by Mike Pompeo, who became Secretary of State, in this year we're reviewing, basically gave Iran a set of conditions that they couldn't meet. Many because they weren't even engaging in the behavior that the U.S. was telling them to end. So, conditions set out by the U.S. government were unmeetable. Trump ends up withdrawing from the nuclear agreement. And now we have this very interesting situation, Will, that I'd like to talk about just as far as the status of U.S. sanctions on Iran go. We have a lot of waivers given by the United States. A lot of our allies have really looked to, I guess, get around the sanctions, are really not wanting to follow them, remaining in the Iranian nuclear agreement with Iran, even though the United States is out. So I'll kind of let you take that from where you want to.
Yeah, sure. So in August, the U.S. sanctions finally kicked back in on Iran. And then the oil sanctions started back up in November. And because of this, several large European companies were actually forced to just leave Iran altogether and stop doing business with them. However, the governments of the EU seem to be trying to stand up to some of the sanctions. And so in August, I believe, I came on this show and we talked about an organization called SWIFT, which basically it facilitates financial transactions across borders. And at the time, I argued that if SWIFT could be sort of insulated from American demands, it would allow Europe to resist the sanctions from the U.S. a lot easier, because they could still facilitate transactions in and out of Iran. Well, in October of last year, of 2018, SWIFT did succumb to those American demands, and they did cut off a number of Iranian banks, and that put Iran in a way more precarious situation in terms of the sanctions, in terms of trying to get around them. And so after that, the European Union started planning to set something up they called a special purpose vehicle, which would provide a way around the international banks who refuse to process payments to and from Iran. And it's kind of a convoluted thing where they have one entity give money to another, but it allows them to basically get around the sanctions. The problem, though, is that this entity is yet to be actually established. established, and Iran is actually starting to get pretty impatient about this. The Iranian foreign minister has even gone in visits to countries abroad and criticized the EU's slow movement on this. And it's really not clear what's going to happen here. If the EU is actually going to go forward with this special purpose vehicle, and if they do, like, what impact will it really have? How much it will allow them to get around the sanctions? Now, just recently, like a couple weeks ago, the EU recently levied separate sanctions on Iran for terrorism stuff, or like assassinations and plots in Europe. And this, to me, kind of signified some kind of reversal of mood within the EU, regarding Iran. But again, it's really not clear to me what's going to come of this, whether the EU is going to, really buck the U.S. sanctions and, how willing they really are to do that.
Right. Well, one interesting part of the sanctions is just how many countries got waivers. Turkey, South Korea, Japan, China, and Russia, I believe, were all given waivers by the United States to continue to trade oil with Iran. So that's, a significant number of countries, including, U.S. allies that you would think the U.S. would have some sway over, like Japan, South Korea, and Turkey. However, they're just kind of spurring U.S. sanctions there. I think Iraq may have gotten a sanctions waiver too, which is what should be a puppet government of the United States if, any of these neocon nation building programs ever worked out right. But I don't, I guess, have too much else to add. I mean, there were at times in 2018 where it really felt like the U.S. was leaning more and more towards, going to war with Iran. And I know we covered, the Syria piece in the good part of Trump's show, because it looks like still, even to this day, I do think that, in a matter of months, most U.S. troops will be getting out of Syria. But, it's worth knowing that the U.S. has, kind of insisted on this demand that Iran get out of Syria. And even if the U.S. leaves Syria anyway, it's still going to be a demand that the very hots of the Trump administration are really putting on Iran, that they had to get out of Syria and Iraq. And so we're going to, I think, continue to see these reports of Iranian malign influence in the Middle East. I'll go ahead and point out that a big complaint of the U.S. against Iran is against their space program. Space rockets are different from intercontinental ballistic missiles. The burn time on the engines are very different. The way the loads are carried and the capacity is very different. You can't just, take out a satellite and strap in a nuke and change the tilt on the rocket a little bit and think that's going to hit Israel. That's not the way it works whatsoever. And so as we go into 2019 and the U.S. continues to, have these demands that the U.S., that Iran stop violating the ICBM rules or the nuclear capable missile rules, that they continue to have malign influence in Yemen and Syria and Lebanon and Iraq, it's important to remember that, there's many other things going on here, including that, Iran came into Syria because the United States propped up, a very Al-Qaeda and jihadist heavy rebellion in Syria. And that's what prompted that response. That Iran has influence in Iraq because of, Bush's regime change operations there. And so there's a lot of more going on here than the U.S. officials are going to say. Yeah,
it really is unfortunate that Iran is sort of a centerpiece of American foreign policy at this point, especially with the ascendance of people like John Bolton into the position of National Security Advisor. Bolton is one of the worst Iran hawks. And Pompeo doesn't seem to be all that much better, especially with his dealings with the Iran deal. And of course, many people speculated, many analysts, I think, speculated that Rex Tillerson, the previous Secretary of State, sort of was booted out of that position because of his lack of willingness. He didn't want to go along with getting out of the deal, the Iran deal. And so, it seemed like he defied the president on that a couple different times. And so I'm not sure exactly if that was the whole reason, but that very well could have been. And I think that's kind of illustrative about, just the position that Iran still has in the minds of American foreign policy thinkers. It's really, it's has not improved.
Moving on to Russia here. Now, we already talked about the Russiagate piece, which is far different than Trump's actual Russia policy. Just before we're recording this show, Nancy Pelosi was out tweeting that Putin seems to have either political or financial or some other word, blackmail over Donald Trump. And yet, if you look at the actual policy of the United States towards Russia under Donald Trump, I think it's even worse than Obama's policy, as bad as, his Russia reset was and how he kind of left office there, The relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin does seem to be maybe a little bit better than between Putin and Obama. But as far as what's actually gone on between the United States and Russia, especially in 2018, was absolutely horrific. You know, we have quite a few stories to talk about here today, but I think we have the largest ever expulsion of Russian diplomats from the United States during 2018 in the Skripal poisoning. We did have one positive, which was the Helsinki summit, but we could certainly find negatives when we talk about the media reaction there. But maybe, Will, let's start with NATO expansion first here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, NATO is continuing to march eastward as it has been for decades. The latest country to join Montenegro was not last year, but the latest country to join NATO was Montenegro, and that was not last year, that was 2017. And I don't think any new countries did actually join the NATO alliance last year, but there are currently 4 aspirant nations that are kind of like nudging their way forward. There's Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, and then, of course, one of the most worrying, I think, is Ukraine. And notice that all 4 of these, all these aspirant nations are Russian neighbors, and they're squarely within Russia's, what you call their sphere of influence. And NATO is clearly being used to antagonize Russia first and foremost. And so in April this year, I wrote a piece about Ukraine's overtures to NATO, a piece for Consortium News, and sort of how they even made a request for a membership action plan in February, which is really initiating like official procedures to get them in. So it's not just talk anymore. They're actually kind of like the ball is rolling. And Ukraine is an especially sensitive matter for the Russians, given the presence of an important Russian naval base in Sevastopol, Crimea. And that had a huge role in the 2014 coup in Ukraine and sort of the Russian response there. And, Russian officials explicitly warned the American counterparts to not meddle with Ukraine, not to add it to NATO, that it's like sort of like their Canada. But yet it seems that the U.S. and the NATO countries are kind of moving forward with that anyway. And so NATO enlargement right now, I think, is sort of in a slower phase, but we will likely see countries like Ukraine and Georgia, moving forward and start to become members. And this is going to significantly worsen U.S.-Russian ties, I think.
Yeah, well, the situation with Macedonia, I think they're about in NATO. I know that Macedonia has moved forward with, I think, some name changes. And I believe the conflict here between Greece and Macedonia, and the reason Macedonia isn't in NATO, is because of the Greek Egyptian, is actually because of the name. The northern region of Greece is called Macedonia. And so for whatever reason, the people of Greece, and this is a very kind of popular issue there, because there's actually been some protests that I think as Greece is ready to withdraw their objection to Macedonia membership, because Macedonia has voted their name to be like the Republic of Northern Macedonia. But the names here are all ridiculous. Macedonia has some territorial issues with, I believe, its neighbor to the north, Kosovo. And so there are potential problems by letting this country into NATO. Of course, the big event, I think, with Ukraine in the past year was the Kerch Strait incident right at the end of the year, where you had a region there, the Kerch Strait, which is now Russian territorial waters since the secession of the Crimea Peninsula from Ukraine, and then joining the Russian Federation. So now both sides of that strait are Russian territorial waters. And I believe a Ukrainian ship was attempting to pass through without following the proper protocols and was, kind of physically stopped by Russian ships by ramming it or whatever. So you actually have some issues here and in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov as far as how territorial waters work and which countries claim the right and what rules to go through their waters. But here you have, I think, a very dangerous situation, moving forward in 2018, where you could really see an advisor like a John Bolton telling Donald Trump, well, we have to make sure we protect Ukraine's territorial water rights to access the Sea of Azov and get the United States into some kind of naval battle with Russia over something stupid like that.
Right, absolutely. And this is partially why the NATO thing is so alarming. Article 5 of NATO says that if any of your allies and if any other NATO members are attacked, then that draws all the other members into the conflict. And so if you have these countries like Macedonia, stirring up conflict with Greece or Ukraine with Russia, this is, exactly the definition of an entangling alliance. And it's exactly something we should avoid.
I do want to talk about the Skripal poisoning. This was in Salisbury, England, where you had a former Russian spy, Sergei Skripal, and his daughter Yulia were found on a park bench, allegedly poisoned by a chemical weapon nerve agent known as Novichok. This is initially presented as one of the most dangerous chemical weapons in the world. Of course, you have all the hysteria with chemical weapons being used by Assad and by North Korea on Kim Jong-un's half-brother to really, I think, kind of rally the intensity and the need to somehow combat the chemical weapons used around the world. Because Sergei Skripal was a former double agent, it was believed, or at least initially claimed, that Russia was behind this. And this led to a series of more diplomatic, but also some sanctions being exchanged between Western nations and Russia. And so, well, I'll let you kind of tell what else you think was important on the Skripal poisoning.
Sure, yeah, this was a crazy story, super sensationalistic, and similar to virtually all such stories about Russia that have come out since Trump took office. Even though this was a British story, not an American one, media and politicians put the cart way before the horse and jumped to conclusions without nearly enough evidence, particularly about Russia. And so, as you said, just by way of background, this Skripal guy, Sergei Skripal, had been arrested by the Russian FSB in 2004, and he was put in prison for like 13 years in Russia. Apparently, for high treason, apparently for working as a double agent for the British. In 2010, this guy was released through a spy swap program and basically allowed to settle in the UK. And that's sort of what led up to him being there and being allegedly poisoned by the Russians. And so after this mysterious poisoning in March, it was almost immediately declared that a Russian plot, was behind it, and that the word Novichok started making the rounds in the mainstream media. They fixated on this term, pushing this Russian-sounding word. And this is Novichok was supposed to be the name for a special class of Russian nerve agents that was developed in the USSR decades ago. But there's tons of issues with this official narrative here. First and foremost, the former UK ambassador to Uzbekistan, Craig Murray, who's now kind of like a whistleblower and a critic, and I think we've mentioned him in other contexts on the show. But he said that he had a well-placed government source telling him that scientists at Porton Down, the main official chemical weapons lab in the UK, that these officials were being pressured into claiming a Russian involvement in the Skripal thing, and that they eventually gave in, but they refused to go any further than describing a chemical, quote, of a type developed by Russia. That was their specific conclusion. And you'll notice that, technically that stops short of a definitive attribution to Russia. It's just saying the chemical was, similar to one that we think was developed by Russia. However, despite that sort of purposeful hedging language of Porton Down, that conclusion was reported as totally ironclad in the media. And then the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog, the OPCW, they came out and endorsed the Porton Down's finding without being any more specific. But I mean, if Porton Down's conclusion wasn't that definitive, then it's not really clear what the OPCW was endorsing or confirming. And actually, if you read the words of the former head of the detection laboratory at Porton Down, a guy named Dr. Robin Black, he wrote in 2016 that and before this whole scandal, so he was just writing as a chemical weapons scientist, just sort of interested in these Novichok nerve agents. He concluded that there was actually no confirmation whatsoever that these weapons had ever been created or used. And even the guy, the Russian who initially claimed the existence of the Novichok program, a guy named Will Mirzanyanov, excuse me, he said these compounds are ordinary organophosphates that can be made at any commercial chemical company. Anybody with a decently sophisticated lab could make these things. And so not only was it not clear that Russia even created these weapons in the first place, but the person who said they existed from the very get-go also said they could be created with just about anybody with a decent lab. And so, even if you take the Porton Down's conclusions at face value and say it was of a type developed by Russia, we're still really far away from proving who even did this. And there's all kinds of other, discrepancies in the evidence given by the official account here. And so, this type of argument would never hold up in a courtroom, yet it was totally, pushed by politicians and the media to say that Russia poisoned this guy. And there was...
And the terrible part of all this, just really quick, is the fact that you have all the inconclusive evidence and yet all these very real steps to destroy the relationship between the U.S. and Russia were taken, including sanctions between the two countries and expelling of diplomats and then the closing of embassies. I mean, this was, kind of big stuff going on here.
Yeah, totally. And, like, the fact that the story was so, like, the narrative changed, like, 5 different times throughout it, like, it was very implausible, and sort of, like, the way the story kept jumping over, all around. And one of the most implausible things was that the media reported that these Novichok nerve agents were, like, 5 times more deadly than VX gas. Yet in the end, this is a big thing, that how deadly they are. But in the end, neither Sergei Skripal or his daughter Yulia were killed. They both recovered within like 2 months or something of this poisoning. And so that itself was also kind of mysterious. Like, why would the Russians not, like, if this was Russian assassins who had poisoned these people, you'd think they would have done their job. It doesn't make any sense that they just came out of it. So I'm not sure what really just explains that discrepancy, but it certainly isn't consistent with the idea of like a Russian assassination plot and that these chemicals are like super deadly.
All right, well, so one good thing, and then probably the worst part about Trump's policy, especially towards Russia in 2018. But the good thing is we did have the Helsinki summit this year, right? So Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin arranged a time to meet, and they went to Finland and had this, big meeting and get together. They talked for some time for a loan. Will, so, big deal in the media. Everybody freaked out. This is obviously the time that Putin was going to get Trump a loan, maybe use some hypnosis, and then I guess, allow Putin to be emperor of the world.
Yeah, with his magical powers of persuasion. Yeah, the Helsinki summit was a spectacle. It was outrageous. The way reporters, like, indignantly stood there and, like, demanded, like, you have to admit that that you're a bad guy, basically. They wanted Putin to admit, and Trump to admit in front of Putin's face that, that he's big and bad and that, he's going to stand up to Putin. But yeah, I mean, there was outrageous comparisons. I think people called it was it the Helsinki summit where people said Pearl Harbor? That they compared it to like Pearl Harbor. Like, I don't know how you could blow it out of proportion anymore. I don't know, the Holocaust, it was worse than the Holocaust maybe is one way you could make that worse.
John Brennan called it treason.
Yeah, called it treason, and then kind of like conflated, high crimes and misdemeanors, the thing that I think justifies impeachment, with the stuff that would justify a treason charge. So that was kind of ridiculous too. But yeah, the Helsinki summit, I think ultimately was kind of good though, because Trump kind of stood up to some of those, demands that he attack Putin to his face or something.
Right. I think it was good, for Trump and Putin to form a relationship. That way, if, Trump ever does have a desire to try to repair some of the relationship between the United States and Russia, he would be able to do so. Especially because, as we're going to talk about here next, nuclear weapons are so important. I do just want to share what I think is probably the most representative story of what the Helsinki summit was. And that was when Vladimir Putin gave Donald Trump a soccer ball because the Russians were hosting the World Cup at the time. And so I think kind of like the summit, this is just a nice gesture kind of move. It's a time for, you to get a little bit familiar with Vladimir Putin. I don't think that Trump and Putin were going to make any deals at the Helsinki summit. I mean, I guess, it's possible always that, especially Donald Trump, anything happens. But more likely, it's just going to be like a meet and greet. They get to know each other a little bit better. And, Putin has a chance to explain, like, this is what the Russia, like, kind of national agenda is. That way Trump could understand it and react accordingly. So, you have the giving of this side. And then the biggest deal was made out of it. Could this ball potentially have a listening device in it? There was news organizations that were running stories that said that the ball that Putin gave Donald Trump had some kind of secret chip in it. Well, it turns out that like every single World Cup soccer ball had like a little some kind of chip in it. You scan it, and then like you have access to like all the like players' profiles and stuff like that. It's the most ridiculous kind of thing. So you have like a nice goodwill event and then a hysterical media reaction. And that's kind of how I summarize the Helsinki conference. I want to move on, Will, to nuclear weapons. Here, Russia definitely upgraded their nuclear arsenal in 2018 with the announcement of, I believe they call them their Avengers, their hypersonic missile systems that bypass U.S., kind of missile defense, THAAD missile systems and all of that. And then I believe a drone submarine. But there is this issue of a short-range missile that Russia developed. Russia claims it has a range of 400 kilometers, while the U.S. claims it has a range of 660 kilometers. The reason this is important is because there is a INF missile treaty which bans intermediate range missiles. Anything less than 500 kilometers to, I believe, 5,500 kilometers is, not allowed there. So, this is an important treaty because it took nuclear weapons kind of off the table for Europe in the European continent there. So it's a very important treaty. And now we have the United States basically withdrawing from it. So I figure this is a good point to talk about, Trump's new national security advisor in 2018 and how he destroyed another nuclear treaty with Russia.
Yeah, so with the INF treaty specifically, Trump initially, I think in October, said that he threatened to leave it, but now I believe in February they're saying they are going to leave it in next month, which is just in a couple days from now. And they've accused Russia of violating this thing for 5 or 6 years. The U.S. governments, various U.S. administrations have said Russia is not abiding by the terms of the INF because of this one missile. Russia says the same thing about the U.S. They say we also violate it in various ways. And neither side really provides much evidence in one way or the other. So it's a lot of kind of he said, she said here. But yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate. This seems to be sort of a move that would be endorsed certainly by the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who also is kind of the point man on killing the ABM treaty, the ballistic missile treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. That was sort of one of like the cornerstones of the post-Cold War order or something, whatever term you want to use there. The sort of the status quo between the U.S. and Russia. On the arms race, and the ABM treaty and the INF treaties, these were like cornerstones of that, and Trump just seems to be, or not Trump, but John Bolton, seems to be an enemy of any type of agreement like this. So whenever he's in a position of power, you see these agreements start dropping like flies, these arms control agreements. And yeah, that's just sort of a illustration of how bad of a diplomat and how bad of an official Bolton is. He really scuttles peace and pushes hostility at every opportunity he gets.
Right, and so I think this is probably the worst Trump policy, just because we're in a position where arms treaties could be met. Trump seems to have a relationship with both Xi and Putin, and the three men could sit down and talk about how we're not going to spend any more of these huge budgetary weapon things, so we can all spend money at home. But rather, Trump seems to be more intent on, when you actually look at his policy, engaging in a nuclear weapons race. He wants to put missile defense of space, which Russia has really been, hoping the U.S. would sign a treaty to not weaponize space. Getting out of the INF treaty is certainly going to create a situation where we're looking at, miniaturized nuclear warheads on cruise missiles, very dangerous. It turns a lot of, just average U.S. destroyers into potential carriers of nuclear weapons. And so now any, U.S. destroyer in the Mediterranean Sea, Russia, now has to worry if it's carrying a nuclear cruise missile capable of hitting Russian targets or something like that. So, I think we're entering, as far as the nuclear arms race and a potential new Cold War, very dangerous times there. And like I said, probably Trump's worst policy of 2018. Somewhere where we're also almost entering like a new Cold War situations with China, specifically in China's territorial waters, or territorial waters claimed by China in both the Taiwan Strait and South China Sea. Specifically with the Taiwan Strait, China claims a one China policy, which includes the island of Taiwan, and that would mean that the narrow gap of water that separates mainland China from Taiwan is Chinese territorial waters. And if the U.S. would want to sail warship through those waters, they would have to, go through whatever the Chinese permissions are to do so. The U.S., however, diplomatically bats a one China policy, but also, I guess, claims Taiwanese independence, and that the waters separating mainland China from Taiwan are partially Taiwanese territorial waters, and therefore we could sail our warships through them with the permission of the Taiwanese government. In the past, this practice was only done once a year. In 2018, it was done 3 times, including twice at the end of the year, once in October and once in November. We had similar practices of increased either bombers flying over the South China Sea or the U.S. sailing our warships around islands, both military and economic, natural and manufactured by China out in the middle of the South China Sea. Now, I think probably, pretty good claims as to why China shouldn't be able to claim these as territorial waters. However, there was almost a collision between a U.S. and Chinese warship in 2018 as the U.S. sailed around these islands. So we're talking about a very dangerous situation here as well, Will.
Yeah, indeed. I'm not sure I have really anything else to add. I think with the South China Sea and the one China policy is a lot of, just additional cases of U.S. intervention that we should not be, going through with. That this is a, far-flung region of the world that should, we should leave to their own devices.
I mean, Trump did a lot of terrible things in 2018, Will. But one thing that I don't think we could end the show without talking about is appointing a torturer as the head of the CIA. Well, I guess we'll call her a torturess, and then it's a great thing.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, the fact that Gina Haspel, the CIA director, is a female was like, the media made much ado about that, but not much about the fact that she's a torturer. That she was somebody who had some involvement in the American enhanced interrogation program, which is one of my favorite euphemisms for something absolutely barbaric. It sounds very scientific and official, but it's for torturing people, doing horrific acts of committing horrific acts of violence on them. And yeah, this is our CIA director, and she's sort of celebrated as being this like pioneering individual because she's the first female director.
All right, well, Will, I'm gonna ask you here to give a grade to Donald Trump in 2018, comparing, I guess, our good of Trump and bad of Trump shows. I guess I would have to say a D- just because he said some good things occasionally, but mostly it was marked by bad. It doesn't seem like Trump, while he has some good instincts like wanting to get out of Syria, Afghanistan, and other places, he's always able to be convinced into prolonging these wars. And really, at this point, unless he's a two-term president, I'm not even really hopeful that we have a lasting withdrawal from Syria. So not a great situation. Certainly some of the things he says are a lot better than the actual policies he's ended up taking. And the worst is that, for a guy that seems to rely very heavily on his advisors, he's moving in the wrong direction as far as who he has around him. Not that, Michael Flynn or Mitt Master were, non-interventionists, but good God, John Bolton is a very, very dangerous person to be in the White House. I mean, I think even the neocon coots think he's a little kooky in his war efforts. Not that Rex Tillerson was a non-interventionist, but at least he wanted to stay within the Iran deal, and we have Pompeo going there, which opens up a hole for Haspel at, the CIA. A lot of his, different envoys. I mean, we just had Elliot Abrams appointed to the envoy of Venezuela. So just, a greater neocon presence in the White House. And I think a real danger moving forward is as bad as, Trump's actual policy in 2018 was. I think the unfortunate thing is the year of 2018 set 2019 up to be an even bigger disaster almost everywhere other than maybe Syria and Afghanistan.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the grade I would give him, as much as I'd want to fail him for all the stuff with Russia, for his nuclear posture review, for, the sanctions, like all these things, I think we can't give him a totally failing grade because he did do things like we are moving forward on North Korea. Syria with troop withdrawal might be happening. We hope so. And then there's even a possibility of some kind of drawdown in Afghanistan that he's sort of pushing. And so I think we have to keep him, below an F. We have to, I guess, give him a D-. All
right. Well, thank you so much for coming back on the show today. And, really for all of your appearances in 2018, I'm sure there'll be like 5 or 6 of them linked in the show notes page here. Tell everybody where they can find your work and how they can support you.
Hey, sure. I'm glad you, thank you for having me, come on here and talk about these things. It's my favorite place to do this. You guys can find my writing at consortiumnews.com, antiwar.com, thelibertarianinstitute.org, or there's no the there, libertarianinstitute.org. Patreon is patreon.com/WKPjournalist. I'm on Twitter at WKPANCAP, ANCAP, and I'm at Minds at minds.com/Will Porter.
All right, and libertarianinstitute.org for myself as well, my daily news roundup.